The alarm on my console screamed before I even sat down, and that alone told me something was wrong. Contracts do not scream. Contracts wait quietly in a queue until someone opens them. This one had pushed itself to the top, flashing in red, demanding to be read first. I had been a mercenary captain for 11 cycles, and in that time I had learned one simple rule. When a job tries too hard to get your attention, it is because nobody else wanted to take it. I opened the file anyway. My name is Rax, and curiosity has never once served me well, yet I have never managed to unlearn it. The numbers on the payment line made me sit back in my chair. 10 times the standard rate for a single extraction operation. Not a war, not a planetary invasion, just a small strike against a border outpost, pull out a listed target, and return to the pickup zone. Jobs like this usually paid enough to cover fuel, repairs, and a modest bonus for the crew. This one paid enough to buy a second ship. I called my second-in-command over, a broad-shouldered gunner named Dorn, who had flown with me since my very first contract. He read the numbers over my shoulder and let out a low whistle. "Either the client made a mistake," he said, "or the target is something worse than they are telling us." "There is a third option," I said. "Read the location." He leaned in closer. The outpost belonged to a species most of the galaxy, called the Soft Ones. Humans. A young species, barely a few centuries into space travel, without the natural strength, the enhanced senses, or the layered defenses that older species carried into every fight. Every merc who had crossed paths with a human border patrol came home laughing about how easy it had been. Slow reflexes, fragile bodies, predictable tactics copied from their own ancient wars. By every measure that mattered in my profession, humans were considered the easiest opponents in known space. So why was this contract paying 10 times the going rate to fight them? I scrolled further down, past the mission summary, past the location coordinates, until I reached the fine print that every experienced merc learns to read twice. Most hazard clauses were generic. Standard language about environmental risk, equipment failure, weather conditions. This one had an entire paragraph dedicated to a single phrase. Terran Special Operations Units may be present. Engagement authorized. Extraction team assumes full risk. I read it 3 times. Then I read it a 4th time, slower. "What in the stars is a Special Operations Unit?" Dorn asked, peering at the screen. "I do not know," I admitted, "but somebody wrote an entire clause about it. And clauses like that do not exist unless somebody, somewhere, learned something the hard way." We took the file down to the guild hall that evening, the wide domed building where every mercenary captain in the sector gathered to trade information, complain about clients, and occasionally start fights that ended with someone losing a limb. The hall was loud as always, full of a dozen species talking over each other in a dozen languages, translated in real time by the small devices clipped to every collar. I found a booth near the back and waved down 2 of the older captains I trusted. Alira, a sharp-eyed trader who had survived more failed contracts than anyone I knew, and a heavy-set captain named Farron, who rarely spoke unless he had something worth saying. I slid the contract across the table without a word, let them read it themselves. Alira scanned it first. Her eyes stopped moving the moment she reached the hazard clause. She did not laugh. She did not make a joke about the pay. She simply set the tablet down, very carefully, as if it might go off. "Turn it down," she said. "Just like that?" I asked. "You have not even asked what the mission involves." "I do not need to." She pushed the tablet back toward me like it had suddenly become unpleasant to touch. "I know what that clause means. I lost a friend to that clause." Farron finally spoke, his voice low and even. "There used to be more of us who took contracts against human forces, full companies, 60, 70 mercs at a time, going up against outposts a fraction of that size, because the numbers always said it should be easy." "And?" I asked. "And most of those companies do not exist anymore," he said. "Not destroyed, not wiped out, just gone, disbanded. The survivors quit the profession entirely. You will not find many captains willing to talk about it, because talking about it means admitting they were wrong about something every guild handbook insists is true. Around us, the noise of the hall seemed to fade, or maybe I simply stopped hearing it. I looked at the two of them, waiting for more, but neither offered it freely. Illyra glanced toward the bar, toward a hunched figure sitting alone with a drink he had not touched in what looked like a very long time. "If you actually want to know," she said quietly, "go talk to Grak. He was there. He is one of the only captains left who fought a human special operations team and lived long enough to tell anyone about it." "Would he tell me?" "He might," Farron said. "But I would think carefully before you ask. Some captains do not like remembering the day they learned what fear actually feels like." I looked across the hall at the old merc sitting by himself, shoulders hunched, staring into a glass he had no intention of drinking. Something about the stillness of him bothered me more than any battle report could have. I picked up the tablet, closed the contract file, and did not accept it. Not yet. Whatever 10 times the standard pay was buying, I decided I needed to understand the cost before I agreed to carry it. That night, back on my ship, I could not stop thinking about the clause. Engagement authorized. Extraction team assumes full risk. Every contract carried risk. That was the nature of the profession. But this phrasing felt different. It read less like a warning and more like a confession, as if the client already expected some of us not to come back, and had simply decided to write it into the paperwork ahead of time so nobody could claim they had not been told. I pulled up the guild archive from my personal terminal, searching for any record involving human special operations units. Most of what came back was ordinary. Border skirmishes, trade disputes, the occasional contract to test perimeter defenses around a human colony, all of them ending in quick, clean, forgettable victories for whichever mercenary company had been hired. Then I found a file that had almost no information attached to it at all. No summary, no outcome report, just a title, a date, and a single attached recording, buried so deep in the archive that it had clearly not been accessed in years. The file was labeled only with a location and a warning that read, "Viewer discretion strongly advised." I sat there for a long moment with my hand hovering over the play button. Dorn found me an hour later still sitting in the same chair, the file untouched, unopened, the cursor blinking over the play icon like it was daring me to press it. "You are still awake," he said. "I am trying to decide if I want to know something," I told him. He pulled up a seat beside me, arms crossed, watching the screen. "You already decided that the moment you opened the archive, you just have not admitted it to yourself yet." He was right, of course. He usually was, which was the main reason I kept him around, despite his habit of being right at the worst possible moments. I looked at the file one more time, thought about the 10 times payment, thought about Illyra's face when she pushed the tablet away, thought about Grok sitting alone at the bar with a drink he refused to touch. Then I pressed play. The recording opened not on the battlefield itself but on the calm before it, a wide shot of a mercenary company forming up outside a small human outpost. 60 armed fighters, confident, joking with each other, checking their weapons with the relaxed ease of soldiers who had done this exact operation 100 times before against 100 different targets. Someone in the recording laughed and said the whole thing would be finished before their evening meal. I recognized the tone immediately because I had used it myself on plenty of contracts. It was the sound of professionals who believed, without question, that they already understood their opponent. The recording jumped forward. A timestamp in the corner marked the passage of hours, not minutes. What I saw next made the room around me feel very small and very quiet. I paused the recording halfway through, my mouth dry, my pulse loud in my own ears. Dorn had gone still beside me, his usual easy confidence completely drained from his face. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. "That does not look like the soft ones," he finally said. "No," I agreed. "It does not." I thought about the contract still sitting unopened on my console, the 10 times payment, the hazard clause written like an apology. I thought about a guild hall full of experienced captains, who went quiet the moment human special operations units were mentioned, and a man at the bar who had survived an encounter with them and never touched another drink he actually wanted. Something told me this was not going to be a simple story about slow reflexes and predictable tactics. Something told me I had only just begun to understand what that hazard clause was actually protecting me from, and that the real answer was still waiting somewhere deeper in the archive, in a recording I was suddenly not sure I had the courage to finish watching. I reached for the console anyway. If I was going to decide whether to take this contract, I needed to see the rest. My hand hovered over play, and for the first time in 11 cycles of dangerous work, I felt something I had almost forgotten the shape of. Not excitement, not the familiar thrill of a difficult job. I felt afraid, and I did not yet know why. The recording waited, frozen on a single frame, as if it too understood that once I pressed play again, there would be no unlearning what I was about to see. I pressed it anyway. The screen flickered back to life, and the story of why nobody wanted this contract finally began to unfold in front of me, one impossible detail at a time. The recording continued from a wide angle mounted on one of the mercenary shuttles, high enough to catch the whole outpost in one frame. 60 fighters moved into position around a perimeter fence that looked far too thin to matter. Inside, according to the mission briefing scrolling along the bottom of the screen, was a human unit listed simply as 12 personnel, light infantry, unremarkable equipment. On paper it was nothing. A rounding error. The kind of number a mercenary company brought a full company to handle, only out of habit, not necessity. The first 20 minutes played out exactly as expected. The mercenary company breached the outer fence with barely any resistance. A few scattered shots. A retreat toward the central structure, exactly the pattern every prior human engagement had followed. I watched the recorded voices of the attacking captain calling it in calmly, telling command the operation would be finished within the hour. Then the pattern broke. The 12 defenders did not retreat into the structure to make a final stand, the way cornered forces from a dozen other species typically did. They spread out. They used the terrain in ways that made no sense on a first viewing, disappearing into positions that should have been useless, only to reappear moments later exactly where the attacking line was thinnest. The recording showed 3 mercenaries going down in the space of a few seconds, and the confident voice on the radio suddenly lost its calm. I paused the footage again, rubbing my eyes, trying to process what I was seeing. Dorn leaned forward without a word, his attention completely fixed on the screen now. "Play it," he said quietly. I did. The recording jumped forward by nearly 2 hours, the timestamp climbing steadily in the corner. What followed was not a battle in the way I understood the term. A battle has a shape. It builds, it peaks, and it ends, one side gaining ground until the other side breaks and either retreats or is overrun. This had no shape at all. The defenders did not advance. They did not fully retreat either. They simply held, absorbing pressure from every direction, trading ground only when it served some purpose I could not identify, and counterattacking at moments that seemed designed specifically to catch the mercenary company off guard. By the 3-hour mark, the attacking force had lost nearly a third of its numbers. The recorded voice of the captain, no longer calm, was requesting reinforcement, then requesting an update on air support, then simply repeating the same question over and over. How many are left? How many are actually left in there? The answer, according to the intelligence overlay in the corner of the recording, had not changed. 12 personnel. Still 12. Not reduced, not reinforced. The same 12 who had been there from the beginning. "That is not possible," Dorn muttered. "No unit holds a line that long against those numbers without losing people. Nobody fights for 3 hours straight without breaking." "Keep watching," I said, though my own voice did not sound steady to me either. At the 4-hour mark, something happened that I had to rewind and watch twice before I believed it. A single defender, cut off from the others, surrounded on 3 sides, ran out of ammunition, according to the radio chatter picked up by the recording. Standard doctrine, in every species I had ever fought alongside or against, called for immediate surrender in that situation. There was no tactical value in continuing. The mathematics of the engagement were finished. Any professional understood this instinctively, because professionals calculate the value of their own survival against the value of continued resistance, and past a certain point, resistance simply is not worth it anymore. The defender did not surrender. The recording showed the figure closing the distance to the nearest attacker instead, weapon empty, using nothing but a short blade and bare hands, moving with a controlled violence that did not look like desperation. It looked deliberate, it looked practiced. Within seconds the encounter was over, and the defender had not only survived, but had recovered a weapon from the fallen attacker and rejoined the fight as though nothing unusual had happened at all. I sat back from the screen, my hands cold. "They do not know when to stop," Dorn said slowly, as if the words themselves were difficult to accept. "That is what this is. They are not calculating the way we calculate." I did not answer him right away. I was thinking about every contract I had ever taken, every fight I had ever walked into, and how every single one of those fights had been built on a foundation I had never once questioned. You calculate the odds, you calculate the cost. When the cost becomes too high, you retreat, or you surrender, or you negotiate, because continuing to fight past that point serves no purpose except needless loss. Every species I had ever fought against, no matter how different their biology or their technology, had shared that same basic understanding. War was a transaction, and every transaction eventually reached a point where it was no longer worth completing. The recording in front of me suggested that somewhere, at some point in their short history among the stars, humans had simply never learned that lesson, or had learned an entirely different one instead. By the 5-hour mark, the mercenary company had lost more than half its original numbers. The recording showed the captain finally ordering a full withdrawal, abandoning the mission objective entirely, choosing to cut losses rather than continue an engagement that no longer made any sense by any standard measure. As the surviving mercenaries pulled back toward their shuttles, the recording caught one final detail that stayed with me longer than anything else in the footage. The defenders did not pursue. They held their position, exactly where they had started, watching the retreat happen without attempting to press the advantage or claim additional losses. It was almost as if pursuit had never been part of their intention at all. They had not been fighting to win in the way I understood winning. They had been fighting simply because the mission had not yet told them to stop, and the moment the threat withdrew, their purpose ended just as cleanly as it had begun. The recording cut to black. A final line of text appeared on the screen, unattributed, with no explanation of who had written it or why it had been attached to the file. It read only this: "Do not assume they fight the way we fight. They do not retreat because their bodies are tired. They retreat when the mission ends, and the mission does not always end when you expect it to." I closed the file and sat in silence for a long time. Dorn eventually stood, walked to the small window of the ship, and stared out at the stars without saying anything either. I understood exactly what he was thinking, because I was thinking the same thing. Every mercenary company in known space built its strategy around a shared and unspoken agreement. Force met force, losses were counted, and somewhere along the way, one side recognized that continuing to fight had become more costly than it was worth. That recognition was not weakness, it was intelligence. It was the entire foundation of professional combat, the reason mercenary work had survived as a stable, profitable industry across 100 different species for longer than any single government had lasted. If even a fraction of what I had just watched was accurate, then human special operations units did not share that foundation. And if they did not share it, then every calculation I had ever made about the value of a fight, every instinct that told me when a battle had become unwinnable, might simply not apply to them at all. I thought about the contract, still waiting in my queue, 10 times the standard rate, a hazard clause that read less like a warning and more like an apology, written in advance. I understood now exactly why the payment was so high, and exactly why so few captains were willing to accept it. "We are not taking this job," Dorn said finally, still facing the window. "I know," I said. Then why do you still look like you are thinking about it? I looked back at the closed file on my console, the frozen final frame still visible in the corner of the screen. 12 defenders standing exactly where they had started, unmoved, unbroken, and completely unconcerned with anything except the mission they had not yet been told was finished. Because I do not think turning down one contract is going to make this problem go away, I said. Every guild captain who has fought them tells the same story, and every guild captain who has not fought them assumes the stories are exaggerated. Somebody is wrong. I would rather understand which side that is before it is my crew standing in that recording instead of theirs. Dorn turned from the window, studying me carefully. You want to talk to Grak? I want to talk to Grak, I confirmed. He did not argue. He simply nodded, grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair, and gestured toward the door. Then we should go now, before he finishes whatever bottle he has decided not to drink tonight, and loses whatever nerve he has left to talk about it at all. We left the ship together, the recording still sitting closed on my console behind us. 12 unmoving figures burned into my memory, far more clearly than any battle I had ever fought myself. Whatever answers waited at the bottom of that guild hall drink, I had a feeling they were going to change the way I thought about every contract I accepted for the rest of my career. I just did not yet understand how much. The guild hall had thinned out by the time we returned, most of the earlier crowd gone to their ships or their bunks, leaving only the late drinkers and the ones with nowhere better to be. Grak was still exactly where we had left him, hunched over the same glass, the liquid inside barely lower than when I had first noticed him hours earlier. Illyra caught my eye from behind the bar and gave a small, knowing nod, as if she had expected me to come back tonight rather than tomorrow. I approached slowly, not wanting to startle a man who looked like he was somewhere far away in his own thoughts. Dorn hung back near the door, giving us space, though I noticed he kept one hand near his side out of old habit, the way soldiers do even when there is nothing around them worth being cautious of. Grak, I said quietly. He did not look up immediately. When he finally did, his eyes moved over me slowly, taking in the guild badge on my jacket, the rank markings, the tired posture of someone who had spent the last several hours watching something they wished they had not seen. You watched the recording, he said. It was not a question. How did you know? Because you have the same look every captain has after they watch it. He gestured toward the empty seat across from him. Sit down. If you are going to ask me about it, I would rather talk sitting than standing. Standing makes it feel too much like a briefing. I sat. Dorn drifted closer, but remained standing near the edge of the booth, listening. I was there, Grak said, before I could even ask the question. 30 years ago now, though some nights it feels like it happened yesterday. I commanded a company of 60 on a contract that looked exactly like the one you are holding right now. High pay, vague hazard clause, a target listed as lightly defended. We were told 20 personnel at a border outpost, nothing more. Standard numbers for a job like that. And it was not 20, I said. It was 20, he confirmed. The number was correct. What the intelligence report failed to mention was what kind of 20 they were. He took a slow breath, staring into his glass as though the memory itself lived somewhere inside it. We outnumbered them 3-1. We had air support. We had better equipment across every category that matters on paper. Armor, firepower, coordination technology, all of it superior. By every calculation my strategist ran before the mission, we should have finished the operation in under an hour with minimal losses. What actually happened? We lost 44 mercenaries, he said flatly. Out of 60, I pulled the survivors out myself, what was left of us, and I have not taken a combat contract since. Not because I could not find work, because I could not make myself believe the numbers anymore. Every fight I had ever been part of before that day made sense to me. I understood how force worked, how losses accumulated, how a commander on either side eventually recognized the moment to stop. That day broke something in how I understood combat, and it never went back together the same way. I thought about the recording, The way the defenders had held their ground for hours without breaking, without retreating in any way that made tactical sense. The recording called it a calculus problem, I said. I did not fully understand what that meant. Grake allowed himself something close to a tired smile. That is exactly the right word for it, actually. Every professional soldier, every mercenary, every commander from every species I have ever studied makes decisions using the same basic math. Is this fight worth the cost? Is the objective valuable enough to justify the losses required to achieve it? When the cost outweighs the value, you stop, you retreat, you negotiate, you cut your losses. That math is not weakness. It is the entire foundation of intelligent combat. Without it, war would simply be endless destruction with no logic behind it at all. And human special forces do not use that math. They use a completely different question, Grake said. I spent years trying to understand it after that contract ended, reading every report I could find, talking to anyone who had faced them and survived. The best explanation I ever found came from an old human recording, something recovered from an interrogation years before my own contract. A captured operator was asked, quite directly, why his unit continued fighting long after the engagement should have been considered lost by any reasonable standard. He gave an answer that I have never forgotten, because it explained everything I had witnessed without ever mentioning tactics or weapons at all. What did he say? Grake finally looked up from his glass, meeting my eyes directly for the first time since we had sat down. He said that most other species calculate whether a fight is worth dying for. His people, at least the ones trained the way he was trained, calculate something different. Whether the fight is worth doing. Not worth dying for. Worth doing. And once the answer to that question becomes yes, the question of personal cost simply stops mattering to them in the way it matters to the rest of us. The words settled into the booth between us like a weight. I thought about the recording again, the single defender running out of ammunition and closing distance anyway, not out of desperation, but out of what had looked, disturbingly, like calm decision. Not the panic of someone with nothing left to lose, the composure of someone who had never been calculating personal loss in the first place. That does not sound like fearlessness, I said slowly, working through the idea as I spoke it aloud. It is not fearlessness, Grake agreed. I used to think that too, before I understood it better. Fearless creatures do reckless things because they do not properly weigh danger. What I watched that day was not reckless. It was disciplined, coordinated, and almost unnervingly patient. They were not ignoring danger. They had simply already decided, long before the fight began, that the mission mattered more than their own survival, and once that decision was made, danger stopped functioning as a variable in whatever calculation the rest of them were still running. Casualties were not a limit for them to respect. Casualties were simply a resource they were willing to spend, without hesitation, for as long as the mission required it. Dorn finally spoke from where he stood near the edge of the booth, his voice quieter than usual. How does anyone train a soldier to think that way? Every species I know of builds survival instinct into its warriors from the very beginning. It keeps armies intact. It keeps commanders from throwing away their people for nothing. Grake shrugged, a slow, tired motion. I do not know the full answer. I am not a historian, and I never claim to understand the deeper reasons behind it. What I do know is that it does not feel like something built through training alone. It feels older than that, woven into how they approach conflict at some fundamental level most other species never developed, because most other species never needed to develop it. We evolved differently. Many of us come from group structures where surrender carries no real cost, where retreat preserves the collective even at the expense of the individual mission. Perhaps humans simply never had that option, somewhere far back in whatever history shaped them, and the instinct never developed the same way. I sat back, absorbing everything he had said. It did not feel like enough of an answer, but I understood why it was the only answer he had. Some things cannot be fully explained even by the people who lived through them. Sometimes all that survives is the shape of the wound, without a complete understanding of exactly how it was made. You said they are not calculating personal cost, I said. Does that mean they cannot be defeated at all? Every force has a breaking point somewhere. Everything has a breaking point, Grak agreed. I am not telling you they are invincible. I am telling you that the breaking point is not where you expect it to be, and by the time you find it, you have usually already lost far more than the contract could ever be worth. My company outnumbered them 3-1, with air support, and we still broke first. Not because we were weaker, because our entire strategy assumed the enemy would eventually stop fighting once the cost became too high, and they simply never gave us that moment. We kept waiting for them to break, and they kept waiting for us to leave. So what finally ended it? I asked. If they never broke, how did your survivors make it out? Grak was quiet for a long moment. We left, he said simply. Not because we won, not because they surrendered. We left because there was nothing left of my company to keep fighting with, and staying any longer would have ended in the deaths of every remaining soldier under my command. The defenders did not chase us. They did not need to. The moment we withdrew, whatever objective they had been assigned was satisfied, and the fight ended for them the instant it stopped being relevant to their mission. They were not fighting to eliminate us. They were fighting to prevent us from achieving whatever we had been sent to do, and once we were no longer a threat to that objective, their reason for fighting simply ceased to exist. I thought about the frozen final frame of the recording. 12 defenders standing exactly where they had started, unmoved and unconcerned as the mercenary shuttles retreated into the sky. It matched exactly what Grak was describing. You said other captains lost companies the same way. I said, how many? More than the guild likes to admit publicly, Grak said. Enough that most experienced captains have quietly agreed never to take contracts against them, without ever needing to write the agreement down anywhere official. It is simply understood, the way certain dangers become understood without anyone needing to explain them twice. New captains occasionally hear the pay is generous and decide the old stories must be exaggerated by nervous veterans protecting their reputations. Some of them learn otherwise. Most of the ones who learn otherwise do not live long enough to warn the next captain who makes the same mistake. But you did, I said. You lived. Why are you the one who still talks about it, when so many others do not? For the first time since we had sat down, something shifted in Grak's expression, a flicker of old pain surfacing through the careful stillness he had maintained through the entire conversation. Because someone has to, he said quietly. Because I watched 44 people who trusted my judgment die on a contract I should never have accepted, based on numbers I should have questioned the moment they looked too easy. I do not talk about that day because I enjoy remembering it. I talk about it because every captain who walks away after hearing the full story is one less company that has to learn the same lesson the way mine did. The hall around us had grown almost silent, the last few patrons either gone or too absorbed in their own conversations to notice ours. I looked at the untouched glass still sitting in front of Grak, understanding now exactly why he had never finished it. Some memories do not get easier with the help of a drink. Some memories simply wait patiently in the glass, exactly like the 12 defenders had waited in that recording, for as long as it takes. Thank you, I said finally, standing from the booth, for telling me. Grak nodded once, already returning his attention to the glass in front of him. Do not take the contract, Rax. Whatever the pay is, it is not worth what it costs to find out the stories are true. I left the guild hall that night with far more questions than I had walked in with, and only one certainty settled firmly in my mind. Whatever decision I made about the contract waiting in my queue, it was not going to be made lightly, and it was not going to be made using the same tired assumptions every other mercenary in known space still carried about the soft ones from the young, unremarkable species called humanity. Back aboard my ship, I could not sleep. I sat at my console long after Dorn had gone to his own quarters, staring at the contract that still waited patiently in my queue, exactly where I had left it hours earlier, 10 times the standard rate, a hazard clause written like a confession, a recording that had shown me something no amount of guild training had ever prepared me to understand, and a survivor who had begged me not to make the same mistake he had made 30 years ago. I opened a fresh calculation sheet and began running the numbers the way I had been trained to run them since my very first contract. It was a habit built into every professional in my line of work, the instinct to reduce any decision, no matter how emotionally complicated, down to a clean set of probabilities, force ratios, equipment advantages, historical success rates against similar targets. On the surface, everything about this contract still looked favorable. My crew was well-trained, well-equipped, and experienced. The target location was small. The listed opposing numbers were low. By every metric my calculation sheet could measure, we should win this engagement easily. And yet I kept returning to the same unsettling detail buried beneath all of those clean numbers. Every calculation I had ever learned to trust assumed both sides were solving the same equation: force against force, cost against value, until one side recognized the fight had become unwinnable and chose to stop. That assumption was not just a personal habit of mine. It was the invisible foundation underneath every mercenary contract ever written, the shared understanding that made professional combat a stable, predictable industry instead of chaotic, endless slaughter. If Grack was right, and if the recording I had watched was accurate, then human special operations units were not solving that equation at all. They were not calculating whether a fight was worth dying for. They were calculating whether it was worth doing. And once that answer became yes, every number on my clean, careful calculation sheet became meaningless. I closed the sheet and opened a fresh page instead, trying to approach the problem differently. Instead of asking whether my crew could defeat the defenders in a straightforward engagement, I tried to ask a harder question. What happens if the mission itself changes shape in the middle of the fight? What happens if what starts as a defensive stand becomes, without warning, a mission with no natural stopping point at all? That was the part that unsettled me most. My entire career had been built on reading a battlefield, recognizing the moment an opponent's resolve began to crack, and adjusting my strategy accordingly. Every species I had fought against before shared that same readable rhythm, the rising and falling tide of confidence and desperation that let an experienced captain predict, with reasonable accuracy, how an engagement would eventually resolve. If the recording was accurate, human special operations units simply did not follow that rhythm. There was no rising tide of desperation to read. Because desperation implied a personal cost calculation, they did not appear to be running in the same way. There was no natural stopping point to predict, because the stopping point was not tied to casualties or exhaustion. It was tied entirely to the mission itself, an internal definition of success or failure that an outside observer could not see or measure from beyond the perimeter fence. I called my crew together the next morning, gathering everyone in the main cargo hold where we usually held mission briefings. I did not sugarcoat what I had learned. I told them about the recording, about Grack's story, about the calculation problem that made this contract different from anything we had taken before. I watched their faces carefully as I spoke, gauging their reactions the same way I gauged an opponent's resolve on a battlefield. The reaction was mixed, exactly as I expected it to be. Half my crew, the newer members mostly, still saw only the payment figure and struggled to understand why a small outpost with a dozen defenders should be treated with this much caution. One of them, a young pilot named Elena who had joined us barely 2 contracts earlier, spoke up during the discussion with the kind of confidence that comes from never having personally lost anything important. "We outnumber them," she said. "We have better ships, better weapons, better coordination." I understand the stories are frightening, but stories grow larger every time they get repeated in a bar. Maybe the reality was not as extreme as the recording made it look. I did not dismiss her point outright, because a small part of me had wondered the same thing while watching the footage the night before. Recordings can be edited, stories can be exaggerated through years of retelling. It was possible, even likely to some degree, that the full truth sat somewhere between the terrifying picture Grack had painted and the harmless picture the wider guild still believed. But the other half of my crew, the ones who had spent more cycles in this profession, understood the deeper problem immediately. A veteran engineer named Halverson, who had survived 2 failed contracts earlier in his career before joining my crew, spoke next, and his words carried the weight of someone who had already learned a painful lesson somewhere along the way. "It does not matter whether the recording is exaggerated," he said. "It matters that experienced captains across the entire guild have quietly agreed to avoid this exact type of contract for 30 years, without needing to write the agreement down anywhere official. That kind of consensus does not form around exaggerated stories. It forms around real losses, repeated often enough that everyone eventually learns the same lesson independently." Quote. The room fell into an uneasy quiet after that, both sides of the argument sitting with each other without immediate resolution. I let the silence stretch because I wanted my crew to sit with the discomfort rather than rushing toward a comfortable answer. Eventually, I spoke again, laying out the choice as clearly as I could. "I am not going to order us into this contract without every one of you understanding exactly what we might be walking into. The pay is real. The risk described in that hazard clause is also real, and I have now heard enough first-hand testimony to believe it is not exaggerated in the way some of you are hoping it might be. I will not force anyone to take this job who does not want to take it." A long discussion followed, one that stretched well into the afternoon, weighing every angle we could think of. We debated smaller adjustments to the mission profile, ways we might reduce our exposure to the worst-case scenario described in Grak's story, faster extraction timelines, additional support ships held in reserve, contingency plans built specifically around the possibility that the engagement might not follow any predictable pattern at all. By the end of the discussion, I had made a decision that surprised even myself, one that went against nearly everything the Guild had ever trained me to do. I was not going to simply accept the contract as written, and I was not going to turn it down outright either. I was going to request something almost unheard of in our profession, a direct parley with the client before any commitment was made to renegotiate the terms of the entire agreement. Dorn raised an eyebrow when I told him my plan. Clients do not usually agree to renegotiate terms after a contract has already been posted. It makes them look weak in front of every other mercenary company watching the listing. Then this client can decide how much they actually want this job completed, I said. If the risk is genuine enough to justify a payment 10 times the standard rate, then it is genuine enough to justify a guaranteed extraction window and additional compensation if the mission timeline extends beyond expectations. I am not willing to send my crew into an engagement with no defined edge to it, based on nothing but hope that the old stories were exaggerated. I spent the rest of that day drafting the renegotiation request, reworking the language carefully to make clear exactly what I was asking for and why. I requested triple the original payment, not simply because I wanted more money, but because I wanted the client to feel the same weight I had felt while watching that recording. I wanted them to understand, through the price alone, that what they were asking for was not a routine extraction job dressed up with an unusually generous hazard clause. It was a request for my crew to walk directly into the one type of engagement every experienced captain in the guild had quietly agreed to avoid. I also requested something that mattered to me even more than the payment. A guaranteed extraction window, built into the contract itself, with reinforcement support standing by regardless of how the engagement unfolded. If the client truly believed this mission was as manageable as the original listing implied, agreeing to that clause should cost them nothing. If they hesitated, that hesitation would tell me everything I actually needed to know about how confident they really were in their own intelligence reports. Late that evening, I sent the renegotiation request through the Guild's formal channels, along with a request for a direct meeting. I did not know whether the client would agree to either demand, but I understood, sitting there watching the message leave my console, that I had already changed something fundamental in how I approached this profession. For the first time in 11 cycles of contract work, the true risk I was weighing was not simply whether my crew could win a fight. It was whether the fight itself even had a definition of winning that both sides would recognize the same way, and I had come to understand, through everything Grak and that recording had taught me, that human special operations units did not seem to know, or perhaps did not care, when a fight was supposed to be considered finished. I sat back from the console and waited for a response, uncertain whether it would come at all, uncertain whether the client would simply move on to the next mercenary company on the list, rather than negotiate terms with someone bold enough to question the listing in the first place. Whatever happened next, I had already learned something I would carry with me for the rest of my career, regardless of how this particular contract resolved itself. Some opponents could be measured through force ratios and equipment advantages. Others required an entirely different kind of measurement, one built not around strength or numbers, but around a simple, unsettling question that no calculation sheet I owned had ever been designed to answer. How do you calculate the risk of fighting someone who has already decided the fight is worth finishing, regardless of what it cost them to finish it? I did not have an answer yet, but I intended to find one before I made my final decision. The response came faster than I expected, arriving less than a day after I sent the renegotiation request. I had assumed the client would either refuse outright or simply move the contract listing to another mercenary company willing to accept it without asking difficult questions. Instead, the message offered a meeting, in person, at a neutral station 2 jumps from my current position. I read the confirmation twice before accepting it, surprised by how quickly they had agreed, and even more surprised by what that speed might actually mean. Dorn came with me, along with Halverson, both of them wanting to hear the client's answers firsthand rather than secondhand through my own account afterward. We arrived at the station a full day early, giving ourselves time to study the layout, confirm the meeting room had no obvious security risks, and settle our own nerves before the actual conversation began. Old habits from a career built on caution do not disappear just because a meeting is supposed to be peaceful. The client turned out to be an older representative from a trading consortium I had heard of only distantly, a species known more for logistics contracts than combat operations. He introduced himself as Corin, and something about his posture when we sat down together told me immediately that he had been dreading this conversation, or perhaps dreading it for longer than just the last few days. "You are the third captain to request a renegotiation on this listing," he said, before I had even finished sitting down. "The first 2 withdrew entirely after seeing the full mission file. I assume you have questions similar to theirs." "I have one question above all the others," I said. "Why does a simple extraction job against 12 listed personnel carry a payment 10 times the standard rate, and a hazard clause written like an apology?" Corin was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tapping slowly against the table between us. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone choosing each word carefully, aware that whatever he said next would either secure my cooperation or send me walking back out the door entirely. "Because 3 other mercenary companies turned this contract down before it ever reached your queue," he admitted. "Each of them reviewed the same intelligence you have likely already reviewed yourself, and each of them declined without even requesting a renegotiation. You are the first captain willing to sit across from me and actually ask why, instead of simply refusing on principle the way the others did." "Then tell me why," I said. "Not the summary written into the contract file. The real reason." Corin exulted slowly, as though the question itself was a burden he had been waiting for permission to set down. "The outpost in question sits along a border corridor that matters enormously to my consortium's long-term trade routes. The target we need extracted holds information critical to negotiations that have been ongoing for years. Under normal circumstances, this would be, exactly as the listing suggests, a straightforward operation. The complication is that the outpost defense detail was recently reinforced, and the reinforcement came from a human special operations unit stationed nearby, apparently as part of a broader regional security agreement none of us anticipated when we first planned this operation. "You knew about the reinforcement before posting the contract," Halverson said from beside me, not quite a question. "We learned about it shortly before posting," Corin admitted. "By then, the operation was already too far along to cancel without significant financial consequences for my consortium." We adjusted the payment and the hazard clause to reflect the increased risk, hoping to attract a mercenary company willing to accept the terms as written. I will admit now, sitting here, that we underestimated how strongly the guild's experienced captains would react to that adjustment. I studied him carefully, weighing whether his honesty was genuine or simply a calculated attempt to secure my cooperation through the appearance of transparency. Something in his posture, though, the way his shoulders had dropped slightly the moment he finished speaking, told me this was closer to relief than performance. He had clearly been carrying this conversation inside himself for longer than just the last few days. "I want to understand something," I said. "Not for the contract. For myself. What do you actually know about why human special operations units fight the way they do? I have heard stories. I have watched recordings. I have listened to a survivor describe losing most of his company against a force a third their size. Nobody has been able to explain why, beyond vague talk about discipline and mission focus." Corin considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I do not claim to fully understand it myself. What I can tell you comes from a report my consortium purchased several years ago, compiled from an interrogation of a captured human operator following an unrelated regional conflict. I have read that report more times than I can count, trying to understand exactly what we are dealing with along this border corridor." "What did the report say?" The interrogators asked the operator directly why his unit had continued fighting long after the engagement should have been considered lost by any conventional standard, Corin said. His answer, according to the report, was unusually calm and unusually direct. He said that most species, when trained for combat, are taught to weigh personal survival heavily against the value of any given mission. It is a rational approach. It preserves fighting forces over the long term, allows commanders to withdraw when losses become unsustainable, and generally produces more stable, more predictable military behavior across generations. "That matches everything I have already learned," I said. He went on to explain that his own training and the training of the specific units he served alongside approached the calculation differently, Corin continued. Rather than asking whether an objective was worth the personal cost of pursuing it, they were trained to ask a narrower question, whether the objective itself was worth completing, evaluated almost entirely on its own merits, separate from any calculation involving their own survival. Once that narrower question received an answer of yes, the personal cost of completing the mission simply stopped factoring meaningfully into their ongoing decisions. I sat with that explanation for a long moment, letting it settle alongside everything Grack had told me back at the guild hall. It was almost the same answer, worded slightly differently, arriving from a completely separate source. That alone told me something important. This was not a rumor that had grown larger through repeated retelling across 30 years of guild gossip. It was a consistent, independently verified pattern, described the same way by multiple sources who had no reason to coordinate their stories with each other. The report also mentioned something about their history, Corin added. The interrogators pressed him further, trying to understand where this mindset originated. His answer suggested it was not something built purely through modern military training. He described it as something closer to an inherited cultural pattern, tracing back through many generations of human conflict, long before their species ever developed the technology to travel beyond their own world. According to him, many of humanity's earliest small group conflicts were fought under conditions where formal surrender carried enormous risk or simply was not a realistic option available to combatants. Groups that survived those conditions were often the ones that fought until a threat was fully resolved, rather than the ones that calculated an acceptable percentage of losses and withdrew early. "So it became instinct," I said slowly. "Not a doctrine written into a training manual somewhere. Something older than that." "That is my understanding as well," Corin said. "Modern human militaries have plenty of standard units that behave according to conventional combat logic, similar to what you would expect from any other species. Special operations selection, however, appears to filter specifically for individuals who still carry that older instinct closer to the surface, and then reinforces it deliberately through training designed to remove whatever remaining hesitation might interfere with mission completion. The result is exactly what you saw in that recording. Soldiers who do not stop calculating the value of the mission, they simply stop calculating the cost to themselves in any way that changes their behavior. I leaned back in my chair, thinking through everything I had learned across the last several days. The recording, Grok's first-hand account, now Corin's independently sourced report, describing the exact same pattern from an entirely different angle, 3 separate sources, arriving at the same fundamental conclusion through 3 completely different paths. "I am going to decline the contract," I said finally. Corin did not look surprised. If anything, he looked as though he had already suspected this outcome the moment I asked to hear the full report, rather than simply negotiating better terms and walking away. "May I ask why, now that you understand the full picture better than most captains who have turned this down before you?" "Because understanding the full picture is exactly why I am declining it," I said. "You are asking my crew to walk into an engagement where the opposing force does not share the same fundamental assumptions about when a fight should end. Every calculation my profession relies on assumes both sides are eventually going to recognize the same signals, the same breaking points, the same moment when continued fighting stops making sense. If human special operations personnel do not recognize those signals the way the rest of us do, then no amount of additional payment or guaranteed extraction windows changes the fundamental problem. I would be sending my crew into a fight with no reliable way to predict how or when it actually ends." Corin nodded slowly, accepting the answer without argument. "I suspected as much when you requested this meeting, rather than simply signing the renegotiated terms. For what it is worth, I do not blame you. I have spent considerable time reading about this exact problem, and I understand now why so few captains are willing to accept contracts like this one." We spoke a while longer, working out the details of my formal withdrawal from the listing, along with a smaller consulting fee Corinne offered in exchange for the detailed report I had helped confirm through my own independent research. It was a modest amount compared to the original contract, but it felt like fair compensation for the risk I had chosen not to take, and for the understanding I had gained instead. Word of my decision spread through the guild faster than I expected. Within days, other captains were approaching me at the hall, asking about the recording, about Grok's story, about the details Corin had shared regarding the origins of human special operations training. I found myself repeating the same explanation over and over, each retelling reinforcing my own understanding of exactly what I had learned. Grok found me one evening, weeks later, sitting in the same booth where we had first spoken. This time his glass sat empty in front of him, finished rather than untouched, and something in his posture looked lighter than it had the night I met him. "I heard you turned it down," he said, sliding into the seat across from me. "I did." "Good," he said simply. "That makes one less company that has to learn it the hard way." I thought about that conversation often in the months that followed, as the story of my decision continued to circulate through mercenary circles across the sector. It became, in its own small way, one more piece of the quiet, unofficial understanding that experienced captains had been building for decades without ever needing to write it into any formal guild rule. You do not take contracts against human special operations units, not because they are unbeatable in every possible circumstance, but because the very foundation your entire profession is built on, the shared assumption that both sides are calculating the same risks the same way, simply does not apply to them. They do not fight to a percentage of acceptable losses. They fight until the mission itself decides the engagement is finished, and that decision belongs entirely to them, not to anyone standing across the battlefield trying to predict it. I never did learn the full outcome of that border operation, whether Corin's consortium eventually found another mercenary company willing to accept the original terms, or whether the extraction was ultimately abandoned altogether. Some part of me suspected the latter, given how difficult it had become to find any experienced captain willing to take that particular listing once word of the reinforcement spread. What I did carry forward, into every contract I accepted for the rest of my career, was a simple rule that I now passed along to every new captain who asked me about that story, the same way Grak had once passed it along to me. You can measure force against force. You can measure equipment against equipment, numbers against numbers, strategy against strategy. Every calculation like that has served this profession well for longer than any of us have been alive, but some opponents cannot be measured that way at all, because the fight itself means something different to them than it means to everyone else standing across the battlefield. When you meet an opponent like that, the wisest calculation you can make is not about how to win. It is about recognizing, early enough to matter, that this is not a fight worth starting in the first place.